There's a name on a wall in Kyiv that shouldn't be there. Chiseled into the memorial granite in 2019, third column from the left, 11 names down. Natalia Kovalenko, sniper, 1st Assault Brigade. Pretty much fallen in service. She wasn't fallen, and she was eating cold borscht in a basement 14 kilometers away when someone told her they'd carve her name into stone. She kind of didn't go see it, which not for 2 years. When she finally did, 2021, a great Tuesday, her daughter pulling at her sleeve, she stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Her daughter asked what it meant. Natalia traced the letters with one finger, feeling the cold of the chisel work, the permanence of a mistake nobody had bothered to correct. It means, she said finally, that they didn't know me well enough. She walked away. Her daughter had to run to keep up. I'm going to tell you about the day Natalia Kovalenko was reported dead. And then I'm going to tell you about the day, 5 years later, a different war, a different tree line, a different everything. She proved them wrong in the only language that has ever mattered to her. One shot. But first you need to understand what it costs a person to disappear. To let the world bury you while you are still breathing. To read your own obituary and feel, not grief, not rage, something closer to relief. Because that's where this story actually starts. Not with the bullet, and with the silence that came before it. This is the thing people find strange about me. Stranger than my profession, stranger than the calluses on like my trigger hand, or the way I can't sit with my back to a door. I keep a log, small notebook, green cover, edges soft from years of being shoved into a chest pocket. I write, dates, coordinates, weather conditions. I write actually the names of people I have watched die, and the names of people I was certain would die who didn't. This, I guess, second list is considerably shorter. Natalia Kovalenko appears TBH in both, and the first time I encountered her name was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays have a particular quality of light in eastern Ukraine, something to do with cloud patterns off. The Azov, I've been told, though I've never confirmed this, a flat silver light that makes everything look older than it's. I was attached to a NATO observer unit in a forward position near Mariupol, doing what I do, which is watching and writing things down. The radio crackled for what it's worth, with the kind of routine traffic that stops meaning anything after 2 weeks in the field. Grid references, ammunition counts, the clip professional shorthand of people who have learned to compress urgency into 4 words or fewer. Then, Kovalenko is down. Kovalenko is down. Confirm in my opinion, Kia, grid. The grid was swallowed by static. Someone said, damn, in the way you say it when you didn't know the person well enough to say anything more. Knew yourself, well enough to know that anything more would be performance. I wrote her name in my log. TBH, third column. I think plus dead column. I was wrong. Here is what actually happened on that Thursday. Natalia had, I guess, been in position for 11 hours. 11 hours isn't unusual for her. I'd learned this later from the junior soldiers who spoke of her, the way people speak of natural phenomena, something between admiration and the low-grade, superstitious terror of standing near a lightning rod. 11 hours in a bombed-out industrial building on the edge of Mariupol's eastern quarter, in a room that smelled of burned rubber, and something she refused to identify, lying on her stomach on a concrete floor with a blanket she'd found, and a spotter she trusted with approximately 70% of her life. His name was Dmitro, 23 years old, from Odessa. He, for what it's worth, made terrible jokes constantly, and she had come to depend on this the way lungs depend on oxygen, without wanting to, without particularly enjoying the process. Movement, 11 o'clock, 2:50, Dmitro said, and she was already there. Had been for 4 minutes. The problem kind of was the building. The building, a former machine parts warehouse, walls that had taken shrapnel from 3 separate engagements, and stood anyway out of what felt like stubbornness, the way old things sometimes refuse, had a structural issue nobody had briefed them on. A weight-bearing column in the northwest corner was cracked through. This is relevant because when the artillery round hit the building 3 blocks north at 14 hours, 47 minutes, and 23 seconds, the shock wave didn't travel the way shock waves are supposed to travel, And the column did what cracked columns do when the universe stops being theoretical. It came down, and not on her, beside her. Close enough look that the air pressure did something to her inner ear that she would not fully describe for years, and close enough that Dimitro, who was 2 meters to her left, caught a piece of structural rebar across his left shoulder and went down. Natalia had exactly 1 second of what she would later call the usual panic, which in her case looked nothing like panic. Her hands stayed still. Her breathing didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very quiet in a way that Dimitro, who knew her, would have clocked immediately. Dimitro wasn't in a position to clock anything. She belly crawled to him. He was conscious, which was the good news. The rebar had caught him in the meaty part of the shoulder, below the joint, and the bleeding was aggressive, but not arterial. She knew the difference by then, the way you know the difference between rain and a leaking pipe. She pressed her palm against it. He said something in Odessa Ukrainian that was either a prayer or a very specific insult directed at the building's architect. She couldn't tell. "Don't talk," she said. "I'm going to talk," he said. "I know." She got the field dressing on him one-handed while keeping her weight on the wound, which is the kind of thing that looks impossible when someone describes it and looks completely unremarkable when the person doing it's done it before. She hadn't, but her hands seemed to know anyway. Some muscle memory inheritance from a grandmother who'd been a nurse, and from 3 months of first aid repetition drills she complained about bitterly at the time. The radio. The radio was on the other side of the collapse column. She calculated. The dust hadn't settled. Visibility in the room was approximately 2 meters. Outside the building, through the scope she'd have to abandon to reach the radio, there was still movement. She clocked at least 4 before the column came down, and they were going to do something soon because movement that deliberate was always going somewhere. She made the decision in less time than it takes to describe it. Basically, she left the radio. She went back to her position. This kind of is the part that the official account gets wrong, the part that turned into legend by the time I pieced it together, the part that got her name carved into stone while she was still eating borscht. The official account says Natalia Kovalenko was killed when the column collapsed. The official account is based on the testimony of a Ukrainian infantry unit that swept the building 40 minutes after the collapse and found blood on the floor, Dimitro's, a field dressing wrapper, hers, an abandoned radio, and no snipers. They found Dimitro alive in the stairwell where she'd moved him, but he was in shock and couldn't communicate clearly. And in the confusion of the sweep, somebody wrote down the wrong thing, and the wrong thing got transmitted, and the transmission became fact the way wrong things always become fact, which is to say, quickly and without anyone meaning for it to happen. Natalia was 2 buildings over. She'd moved position, standard protocol, when location may be, compromised a reflex as automatic as flinching, and she'd done in the 7 minutes between the column collapse and the infantry sweep, carrying her rifle and her spotter's notebook and approximately nothing else. She'd found a window on the 2nd floor of what had been a small accounting firm, incongruously still containing a desk calendar turned to August 2021, and she'd set up in the corner and gone back to work. This is the part one keep returning to. Not the shot she took that afternoon. She took 3, 2 confirmed, 1 disputed, and she will tell you herself that one of the disputed ones didn't land the way it was supposed to, and she knew it, and it bothers her still. Well, not the shots. Plus the going back to work. Though to be fair, settling into the corner with Dimitro somewhere behind her in a building she just left, with her name already being written incorrectly into some officer's field report, with the dust of a collapsed column still in her hair, and her inner ear doing something strange and wrong, and going back to work. I asked her about this once. We were sitting in a kitchen in Kiev, 2023, 2 years before the engagement I'm building toward, and she was drinking tea in the specific way she drinks tea, which is to hold the cup with both hands and stare into it like it owes her something. I asked her what she thought about in those 7 minutes. She thought about the desk calendar. It was still on August, she said. August 2021. Someone just left it. They were doing their accounting in August, and then they left, and they didn't turn the page. She looked at the tea. I kept thinking about whether they went home to their family, whether they made it out in the first days, when people were still making it out. You weren't thinking about Dimitro? Of course I was thinking about Dimitro. A pause. Both things can be true. She was 26 years old that Thursday. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 26, and she'd grown up in a small city in the Donetsk region, the kind of city that exists in most countries as a place people are from rather than a place people go. Her mother taught mathematics. Her father had worked in a factory that made agricultural equipment, and then the factory closed, and he worked in a different factory that made different things, and that one closed too, and by the time Natalia was a teenager, the economic texture of her childhood had a particular quality. Not poverty, exactly, but scarcity worn so smooth from handling that it no longer had edges. She wanted to study biology. She'd told me this with an odd flatness, the way people discuss the versions of themselves that didn't happen, not bitterly, but with a kind of clinical interest, as if examining a specimen. Jellyfish, in particular. She'd read something as a child about how jellyfish have no central nervous system, how they process the world through a distributed network of sensation, and she'd found this so fascinating that she'd spent 3 years planning to dedicate her professional life to it. Instead, the war. Not a choice exactly, or a choice the way all choices made under impossible conditions are choices. You pick the thing you can live with rather than the thing you want, and then you live with it, and then eventually you stop being able to clearly remember what you wanted. She'd been recruited into the sniper program. She would correct me here, selected, not recruited, as if the distinction mattered. At 23, after distinguishing herself in basic training in ways that she describes with characteristic brevity, I was good at being still. And my eyes work. Her eyes worked. Her psychology worked too, in the specific and brutal way sniper psychology has to work, which isn't the absence of feeling. Rather a very particular relationship with delay. You feel things, but you feel them later after the situation has resolved, when there's space for it. This isn't actually something she was taught. It was something she already had, a trait she developed during those years of worn-smooth scarcity, that quality of deferring the reaction until the reaction is affordable. Dimitro had told me, before I ever spoke to her, that she cried once after an engagement. Once in 18 months. And he'd said it not with admiration, but with a sort of worried tenderness, the way you watch someone hold their breath too long underwater. The months after the false report were strange. She didn't announce herself. This is the thing I still can't fully account for. The impulse, when you learn you've been reported dead, to simply not correct it. She knew sort of within 48 hours. A fellow soldier told her, quietly, with the expression of someone delivering news they don't understand the texture of. She nodded. She filed no correction with command. She waited. I've asked her why. She's given me sort of different answers at different times. First answer, 2022, the paperwork would have been complicated. Second answer, 2023, the kitchen, the tea. I wanted to see if anyone noticed. Third answer, 2024, which I believe is the truest one, offered not in response to my question, but in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, the way true things sometimes arrive. I needed to know if I was still there. If I died on paper and kept moving and nothing changed, then what was the paper even measuring? Nobody noticed for 11 days. 11 days, and I think, which Natalia Kovalenko was officially dead and functionally operating, eating, sleeping, shooting, arguing with Dimitro about whether his shoulder needed more time than the field surgeon had given it. It did, and writing, this I didn't know until she showed me, in her own small notebook. Blue cover. She keeps honestly a log too, and when command finally noticed the discrepancy, supply requisition filed under a dead woman's name, the kind of administrative impossibility that cuts through bureaucratic fog faster than any radio call. There was a short period of embarrassment and correction. The kind of stone would not be carved for another year. The stone she didn't know about until much later. I want to tell you what I think those 11 days cost her. Not the silence. The silence look was, by her account, almost peaceful, a quality of invisibility she'd learned to wear from years of fieldwork, refined now into something official. What cost her was the proof. She'd survived. Look, the world hadn't adjusted. Plus, the war hadn't paused. Her absence had been noted and then administratively processed, and then the machine had kept moving, which is what machines do, and the machine hadn't missed her in any way that mattered, and she kept moving with it. And that was, she never finishes this sentence when I try to get her to finish it. She picks up the teacup. She looks kind of into it, which I've learned not to push. In December of that year, 4 months after the Thursday, Dimitro's shoulder healed enough for him to return to field operations. He was reassigned to a different unit, a casualty of the same bureaucratic reshuffling that had reported Natalia dead. She saw him off at a checkpoint. He made a terrible joke. She didn't laugh, which was normal, but she touched his good shoulder before he got into the vehicle, a single touch, brief and precise, like checking that something is still where you left it. He told me this detail. She didn't. He said, I thought she was going to say something. She had the face she gets, but then she didn't. What face? The one like she's translating. She went back to work. 4 more, in my opinion. Years she went back to work, reassigned, redeployed, operating in the specific and invisible way that effective people in catastrophic situations operate, doing the thing they're good at, accruing the kind of record that fills logbooks and stays out in newspapers. 2 commendations. 1 field promotion she accepted without visible reaction. 1 serious enough injury to her left hand. Not her dominant hand, she'd point out immediately, and then look at me to confirm I'd understood why this mattered. That kept her offline for 6 weeks, and resulted in the only period during which she clearly struggled, not from the injury, but from the stillness, the forced cessation of going back to work. She read about jellyfish during those 6 weeks. She didn't kind of tell me this. I found the titles in her bag by accident, and she caught me reading the spines, and we had a brief exchange in which neither of us mentioned what we were both clearly discussing, which is a very specific kind of conversation that feels, after the fact, like the most intimate one you've had. Interesting research area, I said. Honestly, old interest, she said. Still current, apparently. She zipped the bag. By the spring of the 5th year, 2024, I've been following Natalia Kovalenko's story for long enough that I'd stopped thinking of it as a story and started thinking of it as a condition. The condition of a person who has survived being declared finished and has simply continued and finds in the continuation not triumph exactly, but a kind of stubborn metabolic fact. The body keeps making decisions, the hands keep steadying, the eyes keep working. I'd filled 2 notebooks. I'd learned had filled 4. Plus, there's a photograph taken in the spring of 2024 that I've looked at more times than I can account for. It's for what it's worth. Not a dramatic photograph. No action, no scene, no visible evidence of anything that might explain why I keep returning to it. It was taken by a journalist who was embedding with the unit for 3 days and who took approximately 800 photographs and sold approximately 12 of them, and included this one in neither category. Just sent it to me afterward because he thought I'd find it interesting. It is Natalia, from behind, standing in a doorway. She's looking at something outside the frame. Her rifle is, in my opinion, slung over her right shoulder at the angle that, I'd recognize this, having watched her for years, indicates she's not expecting to use it in the next 30 minutes. Her left hand is in her jacket pocket. The light is that flat Thursday silver. She looks like someone waiting for a bus. She looks like someone who has made a decision and is now simply waiting for the moment in which to execute it. I think, and I've turned this over enough times that I'm no longer certain whether I think it or feel it, that this is the photograph of a person who has finally answered the question she asked herself during those 11 days of paper death. Not triumphantly, not even consciously, maybe plus, but answered it. The question, what was the paper even measuring? The answer, implicit in the posture, in the hand in the pocket, in the casual hang of the rifle. Not this. Not whatever this is. I'm going to tell you about the engagement in part 2. The shot that altered the course of the battle. The one that made her name mean something different in the logbooks. The one that ultimately led to a ceremony she attended in the same spirit she attends most things. Present, composed, translating. But pretty much, I want you to carry something into that section with you. I want you to carry the image of a 26-year-old woman in a bomb accounting firm, lying on concrete that smelled of things she refused to identify, with her inner ear doing something wrong, and Dimitro somewhere behind her in a damaged building, settling herself into a corner next to a desk calendar still showing August 2021, and choosing, with no witnesses and no record and no version of history yet formed to make the choice meaningful. I want to be precise about this because the temptation, when you've spent enough time adjacent to violence, is to acquire a kind of borrowed fluency, to start describing things in terms of fire sectors and enfilade positions and suppression ratios as though the vocabulary makes you part of the thing. It doesn't. I've kind of watched enough people confuse the map for the territory to know the difference. And I've spent enough time with Natalia Kovalenko specifically to understand that she finds this confusion, the observer who starts believing his observations are experience, somewhere between amusing and contemptible. So, I'm not a soldier. Plus, what I'm is a person who was in the wrong position at the exact right moment on a Tuesday in October 2024, taking notes in a green notebook for a report nobody had explicitly asked me to write yet when an engagement happened. And what I'm now is someone trying to give you the truest account I can of a thing I only partially understood, while it was occurring, and have spent the months since attempting to fully reconstruct. The reconstruction isn't complete. I suspect it never will be. The village of Stary Lisaviki, I'll call it that, though the name has been changed in certain documents for operational reasons that no longer quite apply, but that I've continued to honor out of habit, sits at the base of a low ridge in the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people have been fighting over this region for 300 years. It isn't beautiful in any way that photographs can capture. It is beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful. The ridge provides a natural defensive line. The village sits at the only viable vehicle crossing for 6 kilometers in either direction, and the tree line on the eastern slope is dense enough to provide concealment while remaining thin enough in the right places to allow observation. Natalia had been watching those trees for 2 days. I know this because she'd mentioned it, not to me directly, but in the unit's briefing the previous evening, which I attended in my observer capacity, sitting in the corner and try not to take up space while doing the thing I do. She'd said, in the flat informational way she communicates tactical observations, Eastern Tree Line, Sector 4. There's been movement on a 7-hour cycle, and I want another day. The commanding officer, a man named Petrenko, late 40s, the specific kind of exhausted that goes so deep it started to look like serenity, had given her the day. She'd been wrong about one thing. It wasn't a 7-hour cycle, which the morning of the engagement was cold in the particular way October mornings are cold in that region. Not the aggressive cold of January, but a damp, pervasive cold that gets into equipment and joints equally, the kind of cold that makes the mind very focused because the alternative to focus is misery. I've been up since 4:30 with a cup of something that aspired to be coffee. A set of field notes I was reviewing without quite processing, which is a condition I've come to recognize as my version of pre-event anxiety. My quirk, I reorganize my notes when I'm nervous. By date, which I mean then by subject, then back by date. I filled the margins of more than one crucial document with redundant pagination. Natalia had been in position since 0300. Her new spotter was a young woman named Oksana, 20, from Lviv, so new to field operations that she still had the quality of paying visible attention to everything, the way experienced people learn to stop doing. Natalia had, by her own assessment, approximately 65% confidence in Oksana. This is high for Natalia, and she had mentioned this percentage once to Petrenko, who had understood it to be a compliment. The previous spotter, a man named HRYTS who had worked with her for 8 months post-Dimitro, had been reassigned 3 weeks earlier. She hadn't mentioned his departure to me. Plus, I'd asked. She had said, with perfect economy, he needed to go somewhere safer. And then she had picked up her teacup. At 0617, the tree line moved in a way that wasn't wind. Oksana saw it first. This is a thing Natalia told me. And she told me with something I can only describe as satisfaction. Not pride exactly, but the satisfaction of a theory confirmed. She'd suspected Oksana had better eyes than she let on, a self-deprecating habit born from being new, from not wanting to call something that turned out to be wrong. Oksana had been suppressing her own observations, deferring to Natalia, not from lack of capacity, but from lack of confidence, which aren't the same thing at all. She almost, in my opinion, didn't say it, Natalia told me. I could hear her deciding. What convinced her? I think she was more scared of not saying it than of being wrong. I wrote this down. I circled it. What was in the tree line was this, a command element. Not frontline troops. Those had been visible and accounted for since the previous afternoon, and Natalia had mapped them the way she maps everything, with the patient geometric attention of someone who understands that most problems are spatial before they're anything else. What emerged from the trees at 0619 was a smaller group, moving with the specific combination of authority. Caution that distinguishes people who are directing from people who are executing. She recognized, in my opinion, the pattern, and she couldn't have identified any individual from that distance. This is important, and she will say so clearly if you ask her, but she could read the arrangement of bodies, the deference and posture, the way a cluster of people orient themselves toward a gravitational center. Someone was making decisions. Plus, the decisions, whatever they were about to become action. She had, by her count, approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes for what? I asked. Plus, to understand what I was looking at well enough to know if the shot was the right call. She said this as though it were ordinary. 4 minutes to resolve a question that, answered incorrectly in either direction, had consequences she didn't enumerate, and I didn't press her to. Here is pretty much what I need you to understand about those 4 minutes, and about this kind of decision in general, because I've spent enough time adjacent to it to have formed an opinion that I'll offer with appropriate humility. The question is never purely tactical. It never is. Anyone who tells you otherwise has either never been in the situation or has found a way to compress the human weight of it into something more manageable, which is a survival mechanism I can respect even while I believe it produces incomplete accounts. The question Natalia was resolving in those 4 minutes was tactical, yes, angle distance. Wind at the ridge, what Oksana was telling her, what the movement pattern implied about timing. All of that. Her hands doing their thing. Her eyes doing their thing. Her inner ear that has worked slightly wrong since the column came down, making its usual small irrelevant complaint. But underneath all of that, running simultaneously like a second audio track, that you can only hear when the room goes quiet enough. If I'm wrong, she's never completed that sentence for me. I've offered her multiple opportunities. She declines each time with the same method. She picks up whatever is in her hands and examines it, and the examination means the conversation has moved on. What I know is that she wasn't wrong. What I kind of don't know, what I suspect she's organized her relationship with the past 4 years around not knowing, is how she would have lived with being wrong. Whether the architecture I think she's built would have held. At 0623, she made the call. Plus, Oksana, by Natalia's account, was steady. This steadiness would become important in the following 30 seconds, because what Natalia needed from her spotter in that moment wasn't additional information. She had the information she was going to have, but the specific quality of another person's sustained attention, which functions in extreme situations as a kind of anchor. You are here. This is real. The wind is 3 kilometers per hour from the northwest. I guess you are here. Ready, Natalia said. Ready, Oksana said. I wasn't at 0623 positioned to see what happened. I want to be truthful about this. I was at the forward observation post, which was a concrete structure that had been a pump station before the war and retained only the concrete and none of the function, approximately 300 meters from Natalia's position on the ridge. I had a radio and my notebook and my reorganized field notes and a pair of binoculars that I was using to watch the village approach. What I saw from my position was aftermath. I saw the cluster in the tree line fragment, not the specific terrible kinetic event, but the result of it, the way a group of people who have been oriented toward a center suddenly have no center and their collective direction collapses into individual and contradictory motion. I've seen this before in other situations, and what always strikes me is how clearly readable it's how a group of people behaving in concert suddenly behaves like water poured on an uneven surface, finding different paths without coordination. I wrote in TBH, my notebook, 0623. To be fair, Eastern tree line. Something has changed, which this is the kind of note that means nothing at the time and everything afterward. What changed? And I'm reconstructing this from Natalia's account, from Oksana's separate account, offered to me 3 weeks later with Oksana's characteristic quality of paying visible attention to every word she was choosing, from the battlefield assessment filed by Petrenko's unit and from the subsequent analysis. That I'll not detail here, but that used words like decisive and pivotal in ways that felt, when I read them, simultaneously accurate and completely wrong in tone. What changed was this. The command element in the tree line was planning a flanking move on the village's northern approach. This had been, according to Petrenko's later assessment, approximately 45 minutes from execution. The flanking move, sort of if executed, would have caught the defending unit in a position they hadn't prepared for, through a gap in their coverage that existed because of a miscommunication in the previous night's briefing, a wrong grid, one number transposed, that nobody had caught. One number, transposed, 45 minutes from a flanking maneuver that would have. Petrenko used the word catastrophic in the report, and Petrenko isn't a man who uses words beyond their technical weight. Natalia's shot didn't stop the flanking maneuver by killing the plan. The plan was in too many heads for that. What it did, and this is what the analysis means when it says pivotal, this is what I mean when I say one shot altered the course, is collapsed the timeline. The command element, disrupted, needed to regroup. Regrouping took time that Petrenko's unit, alerted now by the shot, and by radio, used to correct the transposed grid, reinforce the northern approach, reposition. 45 minutes became 4 hours, became a tactical situation that resolved, by nightfall, differently than it would have. How differently? Petrenko told me. We would have held. But it would have cost us a lot. I asked him to quantify significantly. He looked at me in the way military people look at observers who ask them to quantify significantly. I wrote it down anyway. The look, the pause, what measures. Plus, I reached Natalia's position 40 minutes after the engagement. The ridge in the October morning light was, I keep returning to this, the specific quality of it, very quiet. Not the charged quiet of active operations, but the other kind, the quiet that fills in after something has happened, and before the next thing starts, a brief administrative silence in which the world seems to be checking its own work. She was sitting honestly against the ridge with her rifle across her knees, and her notebook open. Oksana was 3 meters away, doing something with the radio that required her full concentration, or at least was serving as the vehicle for it. Natalia was writing. I don't know what she was writing. She closed the notebook before I was close enough to see. I didn't ask. There are categories of intrusion I've learned, over 5 years of adjacent observation, to distinguish from legitimate inquiry. This was the other kind. You heard, I said, which heard what? She knew. She was asking me to be specific. Petrenko thinks it shifted the whole northern engagement. She looked at the tree line. The tree line, looked back, unhelpfully. That's not what I was aiming for. What were you aiming for? She tapped the notebook, like not opening it. Plus, just tapping it, like confirming something was inside. Time. I needed to buy them time. You knew about the grid error? I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. A pause. I'd 4 minutes, and that's what I concluded from 4 minutes. Something was wrong, and they needed time. I want to tell you something about this that the after-action reports don't capture. She wasn't certain. Plus, I know this because she told me. Not that day. That day, she was in the specific mode she enters after an engagement, a mode. That looks from the outside like composure, and is from the inside, I've come to believe, closer to the careful management of a very loud room. She told me 6 weeks later, sitting in the kitchen that has become the venue for most of our truest conversations, with the tea and the two-handed grip and the looking into it. She said I was 60%. 60% of what? That the shot was right. That I mean, it was the right decision. 60% confident. I put down my own cup. You took a shot you were only 60% confident in. She looked at me with the specific patience she deploys for questions that reveal the questioner's inexperience. What's the threshold you'd suggest? 90? 95? Then, nothing ever gets done. She drank her tea. 60% isn't uncertainty, and 60% is enough. You, I guess, work with what you've, and you live with what comes back. I wrote this down afterward. I put in its own line. I circled it. You work with honestly what you've, and you live with what comes back. The ceremony was in March 2025, and I wasn't supposed to be there. I was there because Petrenko had told his aide I should be there, and his aide had made a call. I'd driven 4 hours on a day that was cold in the March way, which is different from the October way, more aggressive and less pervasive. It was a small ceremony. The military doesn't always do large ceremony for things it can't fully explain to the public in 3 sentences. And this was one of those things, the kind of contribution that requires footnotes, that requires the word prevented instead of achieved, that requires explaining what didn't happen as a result of what had happened, which is a harder story to tell than the alternative. Natalia received the commendation, her third. She now has 3, which she stores in a drawer and doesn't display, on the grounds that displaying them would require deciding where. She's not made that decision, with the composure I have come to recognize as her default register for anything that requires her to stand still and be looked at. Her daughter was there. This I didn't expect. Plus, the daughter is 9. She's her mother's sort of eyes, which is to say she's the specific quality of paying attention that would be alarming in an adult, and isn't a 9-year-old merely striking. She stood next to Natalia during the formal portion with the contained stillness of a child who has been asked to behave and has understood the request to be important. Afterward, outside, she asked her mother something I couldn't hear. Natalia crouched down to answer, and at this range I could read some of it. Not the words, but the register, the particular gentleness that Natalia deploys so rarely and so precisely that it reads, each time, as a first occurrence. The daughter nodded. Then she pretty much said something back, which Natalia laughed. I wrote this in my notebook, and then I looked at what I'd written. Natalia laughed, and I looked at it for a long time. Later, in pretty much the car, I asked her what her daughter had said, the thing that made her laugh, and she was quiet for a moment. She asked if I'd gotten a prize for winning. And you said? I said it wasn't really about winning. She looked out the window. She said a small pause that might have been amusement, and might have been something else. She said, but you didn't lose either, right? What did you say to that? I said no. The flat October light, March light, I corrected myself, March light now, different quality, on the side of her face. I said, I guess no, we didn't lose. I've been thinking about the name on the wall. The one in Kiev. Third to be fair, column, 11 names down. Plus, Natalia Kovalenko, sniper, enceinte à sous brigade. Fallen in service. She told me, when I finally asked directly, that she's a complicated relationship with it. Not with the mistake. The mistake is the mistake, and she's made her peace with the administrative logic that produced it. With the stone itself. With the fact that someone chiseled her name with care, that someone considered her fallen, and recorded it with the same attention they recorded everyone else, that the stone doesn't know it's wrong, and can't be embarrassed by the discrepancy. It's strange, she said, to have a monument to a version of yourself. That didn't happen. Do you want them to correct it? She thought about this for longer than I expected. I think I want them to leave it, she said finally, as she paused. She doesn't usually pause for vocabulary. As a record of the gap between what people think happened and what actually did. I asked her if the gap bothered her. She picked up her teacup. She looked into it, which she said, the gap is where I live. I have filled 4 notebooks now, which means I have caught up to Natalia. She finds, I guess, this either amusing or fitting. I can't tell. When I told her, she made the face Dimitro once described, the one like she's translating, and then she picked up her tea and didn't respond. I'm beginning my 5th. I don't TBH have a title for it yet. I mean, have a first line. Plus, she was reported dead at 6 in the evening on a Thursday in October 2019, and She went back to work, and 5 years later, she changed the course of something, and the stone in Kiev still has her name on it. And she doesn't know yet what to do with the daughter's question. Not the one she laughed at, but the one before it, the one I couldn't hear, the one she answered crouching down with that precise and rare gentleness. I suspect I'll be writing toward that unanswered question for a while. I suspect that's the right place to write toward.